In 1979, there were more than 400,000 licensed amateur radio operators in the United States alone. By the mid-1990s, that number had climbed past 650,000. At its absolute peak, somewhere in the early 2000s, well over 700,000 Americans held an active ham radio license. Not employees of a company, not subscribers to a service, volunteers, hobbyists, people who built their own equipment from scratch, who memorized frequency charts the way other people memorized baseball statistics, who understood the physics of the ionosphere the way a carpenter understands the grain of wood. That kind of depth doesn't appear by accident. It takes decades to build a community like that, and it takes something quieter, something harder to define, to watch it slowly come apart. Today, the median age of a licensed ham radio operator in the United States is somewhere between 63 and 68 years old, depending on which license class you're looking at. Less than 10% of active operators are under 40. The bands that once carried millions of voices across continents and oceans are measurably quieter than they were 30 years ago. Not silent, but quieter. And the reasons tell you something important, not just about ham radio, but about what happens when a community built entirely on voluntary participation runs out of new participants. I'm Jonathan Reed. If you're interested in the hidden histories of the technologies and subcultures that shaped modern life and how some of them disappeared before most people noticed, there's a subscribe button somewhere on this page. No obligation. Now, let's get into this. To understand what's being lost, you have to understand what it actually was. Not the caricature, the nerdy guy in the basement with the big antenna, but the real thing. Amateur radio, from its earliest days, was built on a specific and unusual premise that private citizens, given access to the electromagnetic spectrum and the technical knowledge to use it, could build communication networks that rivaled or exceeded what governments and corporations could deploy. That premise turned out to be completely correct, and the story of how it got proven is worth knowing. The radio spectrum in the early 20th century was a contested and chaotic place. Commercial shipping companies, naval stations, government relays, and a rapidly growing number of private hobbyists were all transmitting on overlapping frequencies with no coordination and no enforceable rules. The equipment was crude. Spark gap transmitters, the dominant technology of the early 1900s, worked by literally creating an electrical spark across a gap, which generated a burst of radio energy that spread across a wide swath of the spectrum simultaneously. Every transmission was a broadside. Every signal collided with every other signal in the vicinity. The people building these sets were in large part former telegraph operators, men who had spent careers in railroad relay offices or coastal wireless stations, who used Morse code as a first language and viewed radio as the natural evolution of the wired system they already knew. The shorthand they used, CQ to announce yourself to anyone listening, 7-3 as a parting salutation, came directly from landline telegraphy culture. Those codes are still in use today among operators in their 60s and 70s who learned them from men who learned them from the original telegraphers. That's a direct chain of cultural transmission that goes back more than 100 years. The disaster that changed everything, the one that transformed amateur radio into a federally regulated activity, was the sinking of the Titanic in April 1912. The wireless communications surrounding the disaster were, by any measure, a catastrophic failure of coordination. The Californian, a ship close enough to have reached survivors in time, had its wireless operator off duty and never received the distress calls. Other ships received garbled or delayed transmissions. Amateur operators on shore picked up fragments of distress traffic and contributed to the noise rather than helping organize the response. Congress passed the Radio Act of 1912, licensed operators, defined frequency bands, mandatory examinations, and, most consequentially for the hobby's future, amateurs were permanently removed from the primary commercial and military wavelengths and pushed into the frequencies above 1.5 megahertz, the shortwave bands, which virtually every professional radio engineer at the time considered worthless for anything beyond local communication. What the professionals got wrong, systematically, confidently, completely wrong, was the behavior of those high frequencies with relation to the upper atmosphere. The ionosphere, which is the electrically charged layer of the atmosphere beginning at roughly 60 kilometers altitude, reflects certain radio frequencies back towards Earth rather than allowing them to escape into space. Shortwave signals bounced off the ionosphere can travel thousands of miles with modest transmitter power. The frequencies the government had discarded as garbage turned out to be the most effective long-range communication medium on the planet. The amateurs discovered this, not the Navy, not the commercial operators, the hobbyists who had been exiled to frequencies no one else wanted, experimenting in their spare time, proved something that reshaped how every subsequent generation thought about global communication. The years between the end of World War II and roughly 1980 represent what most serious historians of the hobby describe as its golden age. And the reasons for that are worth examining carefully, because they explain a great deal about what came after. When the war ended in 1945, something unusual happened in American society. Hundreds of thousands of men returned from military service with formal, high-level electronics training. The Army Signal Corps alone had trained tens of thousands of radio operators and field technicians during the war years, people who could repair transmitters under fire, who understood antenna propagation theory, who could build a working radio set from salvage components if they had to. These men came home and in many cases picked up ham radio licenses. The military surplus market simultaneously flooded with high-quality equipment at prices that made the hobby accessible to anyone with a modest budget. ARC-5 transmitter sets, designed for aircraft use during the war, could be bought at surplus stores for a few dollars and modified for amateur frequencies in an afternoon. HRO receivers, which had been among the finest communications receivers in the world during wartime, were suddenly available to civilians. The clubs that formed around the hobby during this period were genuinely remarkable social institutions. In virtually every American city of any size and in hundreds of small towns, there were local amateur radio clubs with regular meeting schedules, technical libraries, licensing exam programs, and coordinated emergency communication plans. The American Radio Relay League, founded in 1914 by Hiram Percy Maxim, a man who understood that organized relay networks were more valuable than isolated individual stations, provided a national infrastructure that connected these local clubs into something coherent. By the 1960s, amateur radio had woven itself into the emergency communication fabric of the country in a way that is difficult to fully appreciate today. During Hurricane Camille in 1969, which killed 256 people and was at the time the most intense hurricane to ever make landfall in the United States, amateur radio operators provided the primary communication link for large portions of the Mississippi Gulf Coast for more than 72 hours after the storm destroyed conventional infrastructure. The National Hurricane Center's official post-storm assessment specifically credited amateur radio networks with enabling rescue coordination that would have otherwise been impossible. That pattern repeated itself through the 1970s, the 1980s, into the 1990s. Earthquakes, floods, tornadoes, wherever communication infrastructure collapsed, amateur radio operators were there with independently powered stations and the skills to use them. It was not a coincidence. It was the product of decades of deliberate preparation by a community that took its emergency roles seriously. And then, quietly, the numbers started moving in a different direction. The question most people ask is, why did interest in amateur radio decline? And the honest answer is that the question is slightly wrong. Interest didn't decline all at once. What happened was more gradual and more structural, and it started before the internet and before smartphones, which is the explanation most people reach for first. The first pressure was demographic. The wave of veterans who had come home with electronics training and turned to amateur radio in the late 1940s and 1950s were, by the 1960s and 70s, in their 50s and 60s. The hobby they had built was aging with them, and the younger generation that should have been moving up behind them was finding other things to do.
Part of that was simply cultural drift. The electronics knowledge that had been relatively rare and prestigious in 1955 was becoming more common and eventually more commoditized. Personal computers appeared in the late 1970s and drew exactly the kind of technically minded young person who might otherwise have gravitated toward amateur radio. The skills overlapped but weren't identical, and the computer offered something amateur radio couldn't: immediate access to a networked world that was growing faster than any radio band. What almost no one in the amateur radio community acknowledged at the time, and what remains somewhat uncomfortable to discuss even now, is that the hobby had also developed certain cultural characteristics that actively discouraged newcomers. The entry barriers were real. The written examination required to obtain even the entry-level technician license is not trivial. The equipment costs, particularly for HF operation, were substantial, and the culture in many local clubs had calcified around a particular kind of older, mostly male, technical expert operator who was not always welcoming to beginners who asked basic questions. This is not an accusation, it's an observation documented in multiple surveys conducted by the ARLL itself during the 1990s and 2000s. When prospective new operators were asked why they hadn't pursued licensing, the answers included cost, complexity, and strikingly often, a sense that they wouldn't fit in. That's a self-inflicted wound, and it compounded with every passing year. The FCC's active license database tells part of the story. In 1989, there were approximately 415,000 licensed amateur operators in the United States. By 2000, that number had grown to around 682,000, partly due to license restructuring in 1991 that consolidated the existing license classes, and partly due to the elimination of the Morse code requirement for the technician license that same year. That reform brought in a measurable wave of new operators in the early 1990s, but the growth plateaued fairly quickly, and the underlying demographic structure of the hobby, its heavy concentration in a specific age cohort, didn't fundamentally change. The FCC's active license database as of 2024 and 2025 contains roughly 780,000 licensed amateur operators in the United States. That sounds like a large number, until you look at who they are. Technician class, the entry-level license, averages 58 years old. General class averages 66. Amateur extra, the highest tier, averages 67. Those are figures that suggest a hobby with a healthy pipeline of younger operators moving up through the ranks. They suggest a hobby where the youngest operators are nearly 60 and the most experienced are approaching or past 70.
The geographic distribution adds another layer of complexity. States like Idaho and Wyoming lead the country in operators per capita, with roughly 1,100 to 1,160 licensed amateurs per 100,000 residents. These are largely rural, western states where off-grid communication has practical value beyond the hobby itself, where the distance to the nearest cell tower is real, and where the idea of maintaining independent communication capability is not abstract. Urban states tell a different story. New York registers around 300 operators per 100,000 residents. Washington, D.C., the most densely networked square mile in the country, with more broadband infrastructure than almost anywhere on Earth, records approximately 174 per 100,000. You can read that geographic data two ways. One interpretation is that ham radio is retreating to the places where it still has practical utility and cultural resonance. The other is that it's simply retreating, and the rural concentration reflects attrition in urban areas more than genuine growth anywhere. Both interpretations are probably partially correct. The international picture is in some ways even more sobering. Japan, which has historically had one of the highest concentrations of licensed amateur operators anywhere on the world, a reflection of the country's deep culture of technical craftsmanship and electronic hobbyism, lost more than 600,000 licensed operators in the 2 decades between roughly 2000 and 2020. The Japanese Amateur Radio League has been candid about the crisis. Membership in the organization has fallen dramatically. The average age of Japanese operators has risen in parallel with the American data, and the country that once produced some of the finest amateur radio equipment on Earth, Yaesu,
ICOM, Kenwood, all have roots in the amateur market, has watched its domestic operator base collapse. In Germany, the Deutscher Amateur Radio Club reported membership declining by nearly a third between 2005 and 2020. In the United Kingdom, the Radio Society of Great Britain has documented similar trends, with new license applications failing to keep pace with the attrition caused by operators aging out of active participation. This is not a localized American problem. It is a structural pattern across virtually every developed nation where the hobby had its strongest historical base. In 2022, the FCC implemented a $35 application fee on all new amateur radio license applications and renewals. The fee was authorized under the Ray-Balmes Act of 2018, which directed the Commission to recover its regulatory costs through application fees across multiple services. Ham radio was not specifically targeted. It was caught in a broad administrative reform. But the timing and the symbolism were notable. For most of its existence in the modern regulatory era, amateur radio licensing had been free, zero cost. The only barrier was the examination itself. Adding a financial requirement, even a relatively modest one, changed the calculus for prospective operators, particularly young people and students who were on the fence about pursuing the hobby. The amateur radio community's response to the fee was significant. The ARLL lobbied against it, arguing that the fee was inappropriate for a non-commercial service that provided genuine public benefit, particularly in emergency communications. The Commission was not persuaded. The fee went into effect in April 2022, and the first year's application data showed a measurable drop in new amateur radio license applications compared to the prior year's baseline. Whether that drop was primarily caused by the fee or by other factors that happened to coincide with it is genuinely difficult to determine, but the symbolic dimension matters regardless. For a community already struggling to attract younger operators, adding a financial barrier, even a small one, sends a message about the relationship between the hobby and the regulatory environment that governs it. That message is not welcoming.
Around 2017, something happened in the amateur radio world that no one had quite predicted. The high-frequency bands were in terrible shape that year. The sun was near the minimum of its 11-year activity cycle, which meant the ionosphere was weakly ionized and unreliable for traditional voice and Morse code communication. Bands that had carried reliable transatlantic signals a decade earlier were often silent or filled with noise. Into that silence came a digital protocol called FT8. Developed by Joe Taylor, a Nobel Prize-winning astrophysicist who had spent his career studying pulsars and gravitational waves, and Sprantnel programmer Steve Frank, FT8 was designed to operate under conditions that would have made conventional amateur communication impossible. The protocol encodes each transmission into a precisely structured 15-second burst, synchronized globally through internet-connected atomic clocks. The signal occupies just 50 hertz of bandwidth, and the decoding algorithm can extract intelligible communications from signals buried 20 decibels below the atmospheric noise floor, signals that are genuinely inaudible to the human ear. The effect on the amateur bands was immediate and dramatic. Operators with small antennas and modest power outputs were suddenly making reliable contacts across oceans, across continents, in conditions where traditional communication would have been completely impossible. The digital revolution that had, in many people's minds, rendered amateur radio obsolete turned out to also contain the tools to revive some of its core functions. FT8 adoption exploded. By 2019, it accounted for the majority of contacts being logged on several popular HF bands. Websites like PSK Reporter began tracking FT8 signals in real time, creating a global map of amateur radio activity that updated by the minute. The software was free, ran on any modern computer, and required very little technical expertise to operate at a basic level. But here is where the picture gets complicated, and where the ham radio community itself became genuinely divided. FT8, at its most basic level, is almost entirely automated. You configure the software,
Click a button, and the computer negotiates contacts with other computers around the world with minimal human intervention. 2 call signs, a signal report, a grid locator, the contact is logged. That's it. No conversation, no technical exchange, no human voice or Morse key. For operators who came to amateur radio through the culture of technical craftsmanship, who built their own antennas, who understood propagation theory, who had stayed up until 3 in the morning trying to catch a rare station in the Pacific, FT8 represented something that felt like a category error. It was radio contact in the way that sending an automated email is correspondence. Technically accurate, culturally hollow. That debate is still active in the community today, and it captures something real about the tension between keeping a hobby alive in a changed technological environment and keeping it recognizable as the thing it was.
In late September 2024, Hurricane Helene made landfall near the Florida-Georgia border and moved north into the Appalachian Mountains with a speed and destructive force that caught much of the region's infrastructure completely unprepared. Western North Carolina, a rural mountainous area with limited redundancy in its communication systems, took catastrophic damage. Cell towers went down. Power grids failed across entire counties. Fiber optic lines were severed by flooding and landslides. In some communities, roads were washed out to the point where physical access was impossible for days. The standard 911 emergency response architecture, which depends on cellular connectivity and internet-based dispatch systems, failed across large portions of the affected area. There was no backup. There was no redundancy. The communities were, in the literal operational sense, cut off. Amateur radio operators filled that void. Working from battery and generator-powered stations, operators in western North Carolina established emergency communication networks using high-frequency nets on frequencies including 3.923 MHz, which had been pre-designated for regional emergency use. Mountaintop repeaters, including infrastructure on Mount Mitchell, which at 6,684 feet is the highest peak in the eastern United States, provided VHF coverage across areas where terrain would otherwise have blocked signals. The FCC's licensing records showed a measurable and statistically significant spike in new amateur radio license applications in the weeks immediately following Helene, concentrated in North Carolina, Tennessee, and Florida. People who had watched what happened, who had seen what happened when the networks they assumed was permanent and reliable simply stopped working, decided they wanted to be able to do that, to actually be useful when the networks failed. That response pattern has repeated itself after every major disaster that has demonstrated ham radio's emergency value. After Hurricane Katrina in 2005, after the Northridge earthquake, after major flooding events across the Midwest, each time there is a surge in interest. Each time, a portion of that interest translates into actual licenses, and each time, the underlying demographic trend continues on its longer arc trajectory. The disaster spikes are real. They are just not large enough, sustained enough, or young enough to reverse what is happening structurally. The easiest way to describe what is being lost is to talk about the people. There's a man in rural Tennessee. I will not use his name, though his story is typical enough that it could apply to dozens of people I've encountered through research, who has been a licensed amateur operator for 51 years. He got his license at 17 in 1974 because his father had a radio and because there was a club at his high school that met on Tuesday afternoons. He has built, by his own estimate, more than 30 antennas over the course of his life. He has made contacts in 187 countries. He served as emergency communications coordinator for his county for nearly 2 decades, training volunteers, maintaining equipment, and running exercises that the local emergency management office has relied on in at least 3 declared disasters. He is 68 years old. His club, which once had 40 members, now has 11. The youngest of those 11 is 54. He has been trying to recruit younger operators for 15 years. He has had limited success. The knowledge he carries, not just the technical skills which can be learned from books, but the operational knowledge, the understanding of how to actually run an emergency net under pressure, who to call, what frequencies to use, how to manage traffic when the volume becomes overwhelming, that knowledge lives in him,
and in a handful of people like him who are still active. When he steps back from active participation, which at 68 is probably not far off, some of that knowledge goes with him. Not all it, but some. And the same thing is happening in counties and communities across the country, in parallel, at the same time. The ARRL, which has been tracking these trends with increasing concern, reported in its 2023 membership survey that the organization's membership had declined for 4 consecutive years. Total membership sits around 150,000, down from a peak of roughly 170,000 in the mid-2010s. Younger member categories, which the organization has specifically tried to grow through youth outreach programs and reduced membership fees for operators under 25, represent a small fraction of the total. The organization has been candid about the challenge in ways that 10 or 15 years ago it wasn't always willing to be. The 2022 strategic plan explicitly identifies demographic renewal as one of the hobby's most urgent challenges. It acknowledges that the emergency communication infrastructure the hobby provides, which has real, documented value that emergency management agencies across the country rely on, is at risk if the operator base continues to shrink below a certain threshold, and no one is sure exactly where that threshold is. It would be a mistake, though, to end the story at the decline, because the people who are still in it are worth understanding. The amateur radio community in 2025 contains some of the most technically sophisticated hobbyists anywhere in the civilian world. Operators working in the field of moon bounce communication, EME for Earth-Moon-Earth, are bouncing signals off the lunar surface and receiving the echoes nearly 3 seconds later. Working with path losses of around 250 to 260 decibels over distances of 500,000 miles. The equipment and software required to accomplish that as a hobby activity represents engineering at a level that most professionals never attempt. Software-defined radio has opened the spectrum to a new generation of technically minded people who might not have connected with the hobby through traditional means. A $25 USB dongle and a laptop can now receive signals across a vast swath of the radio spectrum: aircraft transponders, weather satellites, maritime navigation beacons, that would have required thousands of dollars of specialized hardware a generation ago. Some of those people are finding their way to amateur licensing and to the broader community. The satellite program within amateur radio, managed largely through AMSAT, the Amateur Radio Satellite Corporation, has successfully launched dozens of amateur-built satellites over the decades, with several currently in orbit providing communication links for licensed operators worldwide. The technical complexity of designing, building, launching, and operating a functional satellite is not small. The people doing it are not hobbyists in any diminished sense of the word.
And there are the contester operators, people who spend entire weekends making as many contacts as possible with stations around the world in organized competitions governed by rules as intricate as any professional sport. The major contests, like the ARRL DX contest and CQ Worldwide, draw tens of thousands of participants globally and are contested at a level of technical and operational refinement that takes years to develop. These communities are still vital. They are still producing real knowledge and real achievement. The question is whether they are large enough and whether they are attracting enough new participants to sustain themselves over the next 20 years. There's a concept in ecology called a keystone species, an organism whose presence in an ecosystem is disproportionately important relative to its numerical abundance. Remove the keystone species, and the ecosystem doesn't simply shrink, it reorganizes around its absence in ways that can be difficult to reverse. Amateur radio operators have functioned as a keystone community in the American emergency communication landscape for a century, not because they're the largest component of that landscape, or even the most visible one, but because they occupy a role that no one else fills. The role of the independently trained, independently equipped, voluntary communicator who operates outside the institutional systems that tend to fail precisely when they are most needed. The frequencies are still allocated.
The regulatory framework still exists, the equipment is still available, and in many ways better and more affordable than it has ever been. The technical knowledge required to become a competent operator is more accessible than at any point in the hobby's history, distributed across websites, YouTube channels, online courses, and communities that require nothing more than curiosity and a few hours of time to access. None of that is the problem. The problem is the human transmission of something that doesn't quite fit in a manual. The knowledge of what to do when the power goes out and the phones stop working and someone needs help 60 miles away and the road is washed out. The knowledge of which frequency to check, which net to join, how to format a message that gets through, how to stay calm when the traffic is high and the situation is unclear. That knowledge lives in people, not in documents. And the people who carry it are on average getting older by 1 year every 12 months, the same as everyone else. I think about the man in Tennessee I mentioned earlier. I think about the fact that somewhere in his county there is almost certainly a 25-year-old who would find this world genuinely fascinating. The physics of it, the history of it, the idea that you can build something with your own hands that connects you to another person on the other side of the planet using nothing but electricity and atmospheric physics. That person exists. They just haven't found this yet. Whether they find it in time is the question nobody in the amateur radio community knows how to answer with any certainty. I'm Jonathan Reed. If you found something worth thinking about here, the subscription button is below. These videos take time to research and write, and every new subscriber makes the next one more likely to exist. I'll see you in the next one.